When the Christmas holidays are looming, and she, as a wonderful friend of the Humanities Center, accepted that. Then I went ahead and scheduled her after the biggest snowstorm.
I'm sure you did that on purpose.
And she's still smiling, and she's still a friend of the Humanities Center. And then I want to apologize for the fact that it's snowing and uncomfortable, and people are thinking of the classes and so on. But I'm glad that so many of you are here to hear, and I think it's a testimony to the quality of her scholarship and the importance of her topic. She's going to be talking to us today on community development versus community empowerment, the challenge of combining them into a neighborhood revitalization strategy. She is an urban planner who specializes in the analysis of alternative approaches to strengthening poor neighborhoods, with a particular focus on community-based development. Her scholarship has played a seminal role in stimulating academic research on the potential of community development corporations, known as CDCs, to make significant contributions to the well-being of poor neighborhoods and their residents. In acknowledgement of that role, she held the Sojourner Truth Visiting Faculty Fellowship at the University of Michigan to do work in that area. This was in 2011-2012. Her publications in the field, she is a full professor here at a major research university, so you can imagine that she has very, very published. So I'm just picking a few items from her CV that relate to the topic. One of her publications is Rebuilding Communities, a National Study of Urban Community Development Cooperation, the first national examination of the activities and accomplishments of CDCs. Another publication is Reintegrating Disadvantaged Communities into the Fabric of Urban Life, the Role of Community Development. And this was published in Housing Policy Debate, which is a journal. Another piece is Can Community Development Reinvent Itself? This was published in the Journal of American Planning Association. And another one is Housing and Community Development, published in the State of Nonprofit America. It's a journal. And this is a very widely used teaching item used in teaching programs on nonprofit management. She was a principal investigator of HUD's national evaluation of the Empowerment Zone and Enterprise Community Program and the Community Outreach Partnership Program. Before joining Wayne State, just to give you an example of the quality of scholar that you have in front of you, she served as a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. She was the founding director of the Community Development Research Center at the New School for Social Research. She served as a senior analyst on the legislative and urban planning staff at HUD, and she was an associate professor at the Kennedy School of Management at Harvard. She holds an MCP and PhD degrees. She holds MCP and PhD degrees in urban planning from Harvard University and a BA with magna cum laude from the University of Chicago. And as I said, she has been a very good friend of the Humanities Center. She's only doing this talk because she wants to support the work of the center and at the same time reach out to people about the importance of the work she's doing in community development. She was a resident scholar twice, in 2004, 2005, and again in 2015 and 2016, and in that capacity, she was one of the most important and vibrant citizens. She attended all the talks that we had at the round tables and was always well read and always contributing important ideas to the conversation. She has served on the Center's Advisory Board from 2007 to 2009 and has presented from Back Talks in the future, in the past, and I'm sure will be in the future. This is her third Back Talk in recent years. Her last one, done 3 years ago, was entitled Jumpstarting Weak Housing Markets, Interim Findings from a National Experiment in Detroit. And as I said earlier today, she's talking to us about community development versus community empowerment, the challenges of combining them into a neighborhood revitalization strategy. So on this cold, damp morning, I hope you can join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Vidal.
Thank you for coming out in the cold and the snow. And thank you, Walter. Walter every year asks for a bio, and I send something very short and discreet, and then he shows up with a manuscript. But always very kind. This topic, not very far into it, and that may show at different points in the conversation, but it comes out of a running argument that people who are actively engaged in community work have been having off and on again since the 1960s. There are groups that do development, namely community development corporations, and groups that do community organizing, either directly or indirectly compete for resources to pursue strategies that historically have been quite different for strengthening poor neighborhoods and creating better opportunity for the people who live in them. And periodically, people say, we really have to figure out a way to do these things jointly so that they're mutually reinforcing. But it hasn't happened, and so this is my effort to try and understand in more detail why that is. To start, I will inflict upon you two definitions. Community development, as I use it, and as it's usually used in the field of practice, is the creation of assets that benefit low and moderate income neighborhoods. Now, assets can take many forms. People talk about social capital, they talk about political capital, cultural capital, financial capital, and all those are fair game in the field, but historically what we observe is that most of the activity and most of the money has gone into creating physical and economic assets. This activity, the CDCs commonly serve a neighborhood as they define it. Sometimes neighborhoods are quite small, sometimes they're very, very large. And if they are very large, it's common that the organization will serve only selected parts of the neighborhood because they don't have enough resources to serve the entire geography. The most common activity historically has been the production of affordable housing, by which the field means assisted housing, generally using federal incentives. Community empowerment is also an effort to benefit low and moderate income communities, but by using a political rather than a physical or economic strategy. Generally, empowerment strategies use community organizing to create political power that is then used to win policy changes that benefit low and moderate income people and places. Often, the target of that power that's created is government. And if people are worried about neighborhood government, about neighborhood improvement, city government is generally their most immediate target and the one that they feel they have the most ability to influence. But neighborhood organizations, sometimes some schools of organizing are very opportunistic about finding community members. They may go door to door, they may have block meetings. Others are much more likely to work through existing organizations. So, for example, the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is one of the largest national community organizing support groups, works very heavily through various types of congregations. And so your congregation might decide to join this local network, and that would create an obligation for your congregation to make sure that at least X many participants actually got involved with the organization. And somebody in a leadership role at the congregation, the pastor or a deacon or somebody, would have to agree to participate. But these organizations are pretty opportunistic. In general, if it works, they're in favor of it, and so it's not uncommon for them to have participants who that are religious denominations or labor unions, sometimes community-oriented schools. The best-known community organizer, I mean, if you ask people who know something about organizing, if they only know one name, they know the name Saul Alinsky, who began organizing in the late 1930s. And I raise his name in particular because he started the Industrial Areas Foundation, and he had a style of organizing that was famous for very attention-getting confrontational tactics. And while organizing as a field is no longer anywhere nearly as militant and confrontational as community groups and unions and others were in the late 1930s or even in the 1960s, the general perception of organizing by people who are in it up to their eyebrows is that it tends to be a confrontational activity. And that's part of the backdrop for why it's difficult to combine these activities in practice. If you don't know either one of them, but you just sat through a description of what they are, it sounds as though they would be natural complements. You have some folks who are busy in the political realm, trying to get created policies and programs either from government or perhaps from local corporations, from banks with regard to their lending policies, whatever it is. They're working for policies and programs that are going to create resources that are available to low and moderate income neighborhoods. And then on the other hand, you have this development organization that is ready, willing, and able to tap those resources and turn them into assets in the service of community residents. And so you'd think, well, of course they would complement one another and work together. In practice, examples of complementary strategies, particularly at the neighborhood level, are extremely rare. The best known one that I'm aware of is in Southwest Chicago. Southwest Chicago is served by Southwest Development Corporation, which is a very a relatively large and very well regarded CDC in Chicago. Nationally, the typical CDC has a staff of about 7. That's the median staff size. So that means lots of them are very small. Southwest Chicago Development Corporation would be up in the realm of having more like 30 or 40 people. So it's a fairly substantial operation. And they have a long track record of working for the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, building affordable housing. They've totally rebuilt the commercial strip that serves the neighborhood. They've brought a major employer into the neighborhood. So they're an actor with a track record. Famous story, they had a site that they wanted to develop as affordable housing. It was being used as an illegal dump. And they tried to get the city to close this illegal dumping operation. And it went to the Board of Aldermen, and they testified about how important it was to close it down. And it didn't, the aldermen voted not to do anything. And it turned out that the reason for that is that the alderman from their neighborhood, that is, he's the alderman for the area with the dump, is getting kickbacks from the dumping operation. And the custom on council is that if the alderman in the neighborhood that's directly affected is opposed, you don't support it. So the CDC said, well, you need to come out to the neighborhood and see how terrible this is. You come out at 6 o'clock, and they arranged a time at the dump. So now the CDC reaches out to a neighborhood-wide coalition of social service providers, churches, schools, and the like, who have many employees, many clients, constituents, people to whom they provide benefits, and they use their network to get 600 people to turn out at a vigil at the dump. Council reverses. So it's a good example of the use of people power when you don't have the financial power to get a political decision made that benefits the community. Unfortunately, this neighborhood is the only one that I'm aware of that has been able to create that kind of two-sided strategy and sustain it over any period of time. And so in some, our question is, why is that so hard, and why doesn't it happen more? I've come up with 4 ways to think about why it's difficult to create and sustain these relationships. The 2 kinds of work require different types of relationships. They require different types of organizational capacity. They are fundamentally pursuing different goals. They both want good things for the neighborhood, but the proximate goal is different, and that means they bring a different mindset and operating style to the work. And the 2 strategies work best at very different geographic scales. So we're going to walk through each of those and see if we feel any more on top of our question. In community development, it's of course the case that the CDC has to be in touch with local residents, including but not limited to people who live in any housing they may have built. And they need to understand well conditions in the neighborhood and the kinds of things that major stakeholders in the neighborhood think are problems that require some concentrated action. But in order to get assets created, the key relationships that have to be built are with external supporters, because by definition, the community is low income. If they had enough income to be able to create these assets on their own, they'd already have them. They need resources from the outside. And so the key relationships that staff have to cultivate are with external supporters, especially funders. Public and foundations kind of go without saying, but in development work, good relationships with financial institutions also turn out to be quite important. And they need good relationships with technical assistance providers. And in the community development field, there are 3 large national financial and technical intermediaries that provide support to neighborhood groups. Here in Detroit, the national intermediary that has long provided services is the Local Initiative Support Corporation. It's in the nature of the beast that those relationships need to be collaborative. And that was the case even back in the heyday of the 60s when confrontation was widespread, but it's become even more the case in the 70s and 80s and following, where everything is supposed to be a public-private partnership. In contrast, in community organizing, the most important relationships are the relationships that the organizers build with resident volunteers and foster among the resident volunteers themselves. And the goal is to make that circle of relationships as large as you can, as long as they are as strong as you need them to be for people to act on them. That means a cultivation of trust. It tends to mean a fairly time-consuming process of making sure that people understand one another, that they share values, and it means often a lengthy process of citizen education and self-education about the character of the community's problems and what the options are for how they might take action so that they collectively develop a strategy. In contrast to the CDCs, the external relationships have a long history of being confrontational. You embarrass the alderman in front of his peers, as an example. The same thing, there were many examples when the Community Reinvestment Act, when people were lobbying for that, of neighborhood organizations mobilizing sit-ins in bank lobbies or even picketing homes of bank presidents. And that history of confrontation, even though organizing uses it much less now as a tool, there are still bankers out there working with CDCs who can remember people coming and sitting in their lobbies. And those memories are not happy memories for them. So the simplest reason, when others have addressed this question, the stock reason that comes up is, well, you can't picket the mayor's office one day and then go into City Hall with your hand out the next day. The mayor's not going to be willing to play that way. So that's been the kind of stock explanation. And the hope is that we can get a little bit deeper than that, particularly because the confrontational tactics are much less important a part of the organizer's toolkit now. Always there as a threat, to be sure, and a last resort, but there are alternatives. Second, these two activities require very different kinds of organizational capacities. If you're a CDC, you need substantive expertise in whatever fields you choose as areas of programming. If that's the development of local retail, you need to know about how people think about markets and how much population and spending power you need to be able to support different kinds of stores. And you have to understand the kinds of space that different kinds of retailers need and so forth. If you're doing affordable housing, you need to know how public subsidies work. You need to know how to work with contractors and write requests for proposals from people who will actually be your builders. You have to be able to negotiate with the bankers. You have to understand the subsidy programs, which are often quite complex. So development activity tends to be heavily staff-driven. The staff are the worker bees. In contrast, in organizing, building relationships among the citizen volunteers and educating those citizen volunteers, even to the point of sending them to national trainings at places like the Industrial Areas Foundation, is the lion's share of the work. And the goal is always to make the activity volunteer-driven and to have the spokespeople for the organization be people who are actually from the neighborhood, with the organizers being in the back row, making sure that things go well and being supportive, but the volunteers are supposed to be doing the heavy lifting. Very different from the professional stance that the CDC often requires. Embedded in that is another difference. A staff with an executive director and a director of finance and a housing person and a commercial and industrial person is intrinsically hierarchical as the way it's organized. Everybody knows that the final word is going to be the executive director, and he's got to take it to the board. So there's a natural pecking order built in. In the volunteer-driven organization, there is an insistence that all volunteers have equal voice, equal role, equal respect. It's a very horizontal organization, and decisions may not be made by complete consensus, but they're made after a lot of discussion, and even if this wasn't your first choice, you've kind of bought in and say, I'm willing to go along. So it's a very different way of getting the organization's business done. What I've called the mindset or the objective, and I don't like either of those words, so if you have suggestions of a better word, that would be a fine way for you to contribute. But the community development organization, to be successful, has to assume responsibility for figuring out what projects and activities are needed, reality testing that with the community, but they're in the driver's seat in terms of figuring that out. And then assume responsibility for bringing together the resources that will be required and actually making sure the project is brought to a successful completion. That's your job, and if you don't do it, the community has a right to come and complain. Right? Community organizing, the whole purpose of this organization is to hold other people accountable for the things that they are responsible for. The banker is responsible for making loans, and he's responsible for making loans to everybody who's a customer at the bank if the person can qualify. And if he's not doing that, he's not meeting his responsibility, and people will say, banker, you're not doing your job. In San Antonio, widespread flooding in West Side neighborhoods, mostly poor and Latino, and they organized and basically said, our neighborhoods flood and other people's neighborhoods don't flood. You're supposed to be the mayor and the council of the whole city. Fix this. And they won a bond issue, a major $25 million bond issue. That is organization in San Antonio is called COPS. It's generally regarded as the best practice example of organizing in the country. But it's very much about holding other people accountable. And if you try to think about what it's like to have a conversation that's collaborative there, you can imagine it. It's certainly very hard to think about going from one hat to the other quickly, say, within the same staff meeting. And organizations that do have, I mean, CDCs that have organizers on staff, and there aren't a lot of them, but there are some, often report that that's an issue in staff meetings, because the organizers tend to want to talk about different issues than the people who are responsible for the development practices. Finally, community development has its largest impact in terms of actually improving neighborhood conditions in a clear, demonstrable, we can go out and find high quality evidence of making a change if it's geographically concentrated. You find, say, a key intersection in the commercial district, and you really concentrate a lot of resources on getting that intersection, all the buildings, redeveloped, brought up to code, looking nice, street furniture, fix the bus stop, so that there's a very visible impact that changes people's perceptions of the community that's all around that intersection, and hence encourages more investment to come. So targeting is a very important part of good strategy in development. If you're thinking about building a power base and you want to influence the mayor or the council or the state legislature, you want the biggest, the broadest power base that you can get, because you want those elected officials to see as many prospective voters as possible, and you want them to know that even people who may not have been to this meeting are nevertheless on board with this agenda, and that includes all these congregations. It includes all these schools and their staffs. It includes these religious orders, and those people are all on board. You want this very broad agenda. But in order to get all those people to buy in, all those people aren't going to buy in to help Southwest Development Corporation get their dump shut down. If I live on the north side of Chicago, I say, that's really too bad, but I'm busy. You know, if you want a lot of people to show up, get your residents out and make them show up. And in order to get this broad coalition, you need broad benefits. That's why we can now point to a fair number of successful organizing campaigns at the city level, the county level, around the living wage issue. I mean, it may be framed in different ways in different local campaigns, but those are broadly shared. Now, some CDCs participate in those, but that's not their main activity that they do. And those produce benefits to the CDC community, to be sure, because the whole community is better off if a larger share of the people in it who are working are actually bringing home a family supporting salary. There's no doubt the community's better off as a result. But there isn't anything that the CDC can point to that they get credit for, and it doesn't help them directly in any way. It may mean there's more spending power at the supermarket they help to bring to the neighborhood, or it may mean people in assisted housing are more likely to be able to pay their rent on time, so the property manager's job gets easier. But the fact that there's this disconnect between the geographies, and one is seeking benefits that can be very targeted, and one is seeking benefits that are to be broadly shared, like regional transit. The other issue that I've been kind of noodling with that is about geography is that the Southwest Chicago example works because that neighborhood is large enough and well organized enough both to have a very capable development organization and to have a rich network of social service organizations, boys and girls clubs, congregations, community-oriented schools, and the like, who can be drawn on as a resource. And there aren't, I mean, if you think about the neighborhoods that you know, there aren't that many neighborhoods that have that kind of very powerful combination as raw material. And building new organizational capacity, either on the organizing side or the development side, is a major piece of business. Starting from scratch to build organizational capacity is a lot of work. You're talking years of investment with no real guarantee of success. And so in most places, the kinds of raw material that through luck and some smart people seizing opportunities arose in Southwest Chicago can't be found in very many places. Having painted a bleak picture, there are some pluses to be pointed to. There are a small number of places, Boston being the largest, the best known and the most extensive. Boston has a very large and highly productive CDC network, and they persuaded the local funding community that it was important for them to add organizing to their agenda. And they eventually won that, at least for some of their members. The examples that I referred to of the organizers on staff wanting to talk about different things than the developers, examples from Boston. Two things about organizing. One is that it does require constant staff support, because the kinds of relationships that you build with resident volunteers have to be continually renewed, or they atrophy very, very quickly. And there are always people, once trained and well integrated into the organization, who fall by the roadside. Life happens, you know. They have twins. Somebody loses a job, and they can't engage now, perhaps for years. So you're always building, even to stay even. And that requires consistent funder support. And it's not that easy to demonstrate to funders what the product is. The other thing is that as development organizations, I think a dozen of the CDCs got funded to do organizing. And all but one or two elected to do what the field would have called consensus organizing, or organizing for co-production. So if I'm a CDC with an assisted housing development, say I've got 100 units of assisted housing, it's very much in my interest, particularly if I run a decent building, to have the tenants be organized. So if I have an issue with tenants generally, there's a place for me to go to as the manager. There are cultivated relationships between management and tenants. Tenants can have a voice in, you know, we only have X much discretionary income. Let's have your input. You know, is it more important to add bicycle racks, or is it more important to get everybody new storm screens? So there's a relationship there, using that as a vehicle to educate tenants, particularly new tenants, about their responsibilities. No, it's not okay to have your little boy ride his tricycle in the hallways and run into the wall. Yes, you really have to put your garbage down the chute. You can't just leave it by the elevator or in the stairs. That is very useful, and though they become better tenants and the housing is a better place. Community safety programs commonly involve going out and organizing and getting block watch groups trained and mobilized and connected to a local police officer or precinct. So they tended to do that kind of organizing. Once mobilized, those people who help with the safety program can very likely be called upon if you ever had a beef with the mayor and you wanted to be able to show up with 30 people, because they'd already be familiar with the organization and what it does, they'd know the staff, and they would already have made investments in the community personally. But it's not really the same, it's not really what an Alinsky organizer means when she talks about building a power base. The other place where you do see successful collaboration, and I haven't thought about this very much because I just thought of it today when I was fine-tuning this, is that the national community development intermediaries and a wide array of advocacy groups, not Alinsky-style organizers, but full-time advocates, collaborate extensively and very effectively in trying to shape and win support for national legislation. There's a long history of low-income housing advocates collaborating with LISC and the Enterprise Foundation and others to try and shape federal legislation, win larger appropriations, for example, for the housing voucher program. And that led me to suppose that there might be a way to make some headway on this issue by attending to the task of, at the state level, building more effective CDC networks. A lot of the progressive organizing campaigns that have attracted national attention took place in California. And that's partly because that's just the way California works. But because that's the way California works, it's also the case that at the state level, affordable housing providers, which includes but is not limited to CDCs, are incredibly well organized. They have one organization for Northern California, one for Southern California. They're both large, they're well attended, they do great training, they know everybody in Sacramento, and they collaborate on broad campaigns. And so it may be that there are targets of opportunity, at least in states that have substantial numbers of CDCs, of being more effective in exerting political muscle if that takes place at the state level, because most of the CDC associations that really do something, as opposed to just have a letterhead, are at the local level. There are some very good state organizations and their numbers are growing, but some thoughtful strategic support to beef up that part of the industry, which generally flies below the radar, might be a way to make some headway. So that's as far as I've gotten. Welcome your questions and comments.
What's the time for questions and comments?
I hate it when everybody talks at once.
I'll start. Given the new political reality promised by President-elect Trump, do you see a shift in the power balance between CDCs and community organizers, and might one become more or less relevant with changes coming forward in things like HUD policies or even the presence of LITAC as an option?
No. And the reason I say that is that I think there are ingredients in the mix for both groups. I think that if people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren continue to be active and vocal and actually out trying to mobilize people, that organizing in general, maybe not through the old organizations like Industrial Areas Foundation, will draw substantial numbers of people, particularly if a new Trump administration gives them something to complain about, which seems likely. On the other hand, when it seems, given the 3 or 4 words that the president-elect has had to say about housing and HUD generally, Ben Carson is generally known as somebody who is not much in support of housing assistance. And certainly when Ronald Reagan was elected, the philanthropic community, both corporate and people like Ford and Kellogg and so forth, were tripping all over themselves to pony up additional resources to shore up community groups that they felt were going to be badly strapped and perhaps even under attack. And while I don't think the foundation community will respond in quite the same way this time, because there's so many more things that they're likely to be concerned about, I think that well, let me put it this way. If federal housing subsidies are reduced, that hurts the development people a lot. But there are lots of developers who think affordable housing construction programs are a really good thing. And there are many bankers who sit on the local and national boards of people like the Enterprise Foundation and Local Initiative Support Corporation. So it's not as though the corporate sector is just going to roll over on that. I think the big unknown is what happens to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, because that's a huge fraction of the mortgage market. And if something goes wrong there, then that could be very bad for the development business across the board. But caveat, my crystal ball is not any better than anybody else's. Yes.
Another crystal ball question. In your opinion, you brought up RTA earlier. Do you think that there are ways that these two groups can work together to make something like RTA successful in the future if they were to go at a ballot initiative again? Do you think that there were things they could have done better in this cycle to have been successful?
Well, I think that people in the CDC community were working on it, but the CDC community in this region is heavily concentrated in Detroit, and the principal failing was in not making it clear that there would be broad benefits as opposed to narrowly targeted benefits that help poor people and old people and disabled people. And so it seems to me that what the CDCs are both not very numerous, and there are a few strong ones, but there are many that are not very strong. And they don't have the same kind of presence in this region that, for example, CDCs do in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York, where they're players. And so I think there's obviously a lot of work to be done there, but I don't know that the development side can do a lot. And I'm honestly not very clear about exactly what Moses' role was. Moses is the local organizing activity in this region, and I saw no references to them in the media about the campaign. That doesn't mean they weren't busy, but because they're not headline grabbers. But I don't know whether they were doing everything they should have done or whether they could have done more.
So it occurred to me that we tend to think of community organizing as a left wing thing, for want of better words. So we think of Alinsky, et cetera, et cetera. But community organizing may also be a conservative right wing thing, right? It might take on a different flavor and look different, and it might work in rural areas as opposed to urban areas, et cetera, et cetera. So just a thought or a comment, you might be entering a new era of community organizing that's right of center as opposed to left of center.
It's possible, but that any effort of that sort, unless there's some way to build off of the quiet organizing that was, not organizing, but strategizing that was done by the Trump campaign and totally below the radar, would have some work to do, because the foundations, most of the effective examples of organizing that you can point to had some affiliation with one of the major national support networks, whether it's IAF or DART or PICO, there's a bunch of them. And starting from scratch is, as I said, a lot of work. And I'm not sure who would find it valuable to undertake that. It seemed to me the right wing of the Republican Party has found other vehicles that are like, controlling state legislatures as a strategy. It's not a populist strategy. And I don't know who on the right would find a populist strategy attractive and what they would want to use it for.
I think they'll find it attractive. But no, make it point. But again, the methods of organizing have probably changed from the 1970s to today. Right? So you may not need a national organization to to help people organize these days, because there's social media, there's fake news and stuff that you can do with that.
That really would be a new technology, because all the existing schools of organizing, one way or another, are grounded in a commitment to identifying, to building personal relationships with people that you can count on when the chips are down. And you can count on them when the chips are down because you've worked through the fact that you're confident their values are the same. And social media is very good at identifying large numbers of people who are connected at this level, but it's very poor at drilling down to find people who are committed at foundational levels, and it doesn't do a very good job, I don't think, of weeding through at that level. And so you would have to have a whole different notion of what you were trying to do. If all you need to do is get people out to vote for candidate Obama, it might work okay, but if you had a broader change agenda, I honestly think Obama had that kind of a network and deliberately elected not energize it, which a lot of people think was a mistake. But again, you might want to ask somebody who's more knowledgeable about the political right.
There's a question across here. Were you trying to ask a question?
Oh, thank you. I was curious to hear more about your thoughts on, since community organizing and CDCs are so local, how do you see this change with access to the internet and social media moving forward? What do you see? How do you see that making any large impact on connecting these folks to making change on national policy that people can agree to? Just saying, you don't feel that you still feel it's so local.
I think the people who do the work see it as being local. I think it was very telling that when Moses was formed, it was a coalition of 3 pre-existing networks of congregations in Detroit. And they came together with encouragement from the Gamaliel Foundation, which is their version of the IAF, because the Gamaliel Foundation had been persuaded by people like David Rusk and Myron Orfield that a regional strategy was required if you were going to have real structural change at the metropolitan level. That if cities just kept doing their own thing, there was never going to be enough resources to make meaningful change for the poor. And so they committed to a strategy that would deliberately reach out and try to make common cause with suburban congregations. And they would also start bringing in labor unions and others to help with work on issues. They become much more focused issues at the regional level. And the result of that was that they made some progress on the regional level. They were important in getting the RTA passed the first time. But their base at the congregational level fell apart because there were not enough staff and a lot of iron in the fire. And so a lot of the neighborhood level people said, well, regional transit is important, but we still care about the park across the street from the church. We still care about the kids who don't have after-school activities. And suburban congregants had a hard time identifying with those issues. And so it wasn't, I mean, in the end, it only works if people vote with their time and energy. And development also is local. Where the policy comes in on development is on chasing the money. And that, I think, you could get very broad collaboration, and I think things like, email your congressperson to vote on HR 1212, I think you could do a lot of that. But that's pretty, write letters to your congressman has been around a long time. It's easier and faster, so more people do it now.
I think the most recent example of this would be the Standing Rock Facebook thing, which who knows what the effectiveness of that was other than elevating it to national consciousness. But there are tactics happening on social media that, and to Raymond's point, right wing, the tactic is trolling, so.
I'm unwilling to put that in the same category as organizing.
Well, yeah, but
it is real, but
I think they are adopting the language of organizing. They see themselves as a movement and as a coalition building, and now they just are. I think we ignore them, and obviously, so it's a mistake to ignore them.
it's all true.
Still have time for some questions, comments. If not, let's thank her very much.
I have one more question, sir. I'm not sure if you spoke about this, I'm sorry we came in a couple minutes late, but the community benefits agreements in Detroit, I'm just kind of curious about what maybe they were flawed from their actual, the writing or the construction of the ballot initiatives, but the failings or of those in terms of getting community development and community organizers to work together towards community benefits and ordinance.
To me, it seems like a hard marriage to build. I mean, I'm not sure what community organizing efforts you're referring to. Certainly Moses would.
Sugar Law Center is something of a community organizing group. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. I don't know.
I'm not aware of their activities. I think of them as an advocacy
It was a
rather than a
Powell's platform.
Oh, okay.
It worked in partnership with Sugar Law. Like you said, with an advocacy organization. But it goes back to what you were saying, is that when you don't have enough staff, you can't effectively mobilize the community. So you try to use like you said, social media, but like you say, it's at that particular level. So that whole personal level, and that can be tied to the RTA, because I think a lot of organizations, like we talk about Moses, True, and can't think of the other one, with Joel, but they were upset with RTA in the sense that RTA paid this outside PR firm to handle the relationship with the RTA. And they were saying, since we're not getting any funds, they need to do all the work. So it became very selfish in a sense, you know what I'm saying? Like, even though the greater good was to pass the RTA, they felt like, you know, we're not getting any of the funding. We're just gonna continue to do what we do. And it goes back to what you were saying, because they're so limited in terms of their staff, they didn't really put a huge effort out. You know, they did the work, but they didn't go over and beyond, you know? So you get a situation where in Detroit, where, you know, almost 25,000 people didn't vote, you know, in their best interest for RTA, and it failed by 18,000. So with a little bit more organizing, the whole picture could look different.
And also framing the case
Absolutely.
differently.
Yeah, and it should have been framed many different ways, and it could possibly have been done that way, but it wasn't. It was the old lady who wanted to be independent, but if you're Detroit and you use the bus, you know that SMART has the disability program. So you say, oh, this is a lot. So when it was just it was really bizarre, like how they try to make.
Other places that have more successfully sold transit have heavily emphasized its economic development
Right.
benefits. And it seemed, that wasn't absent from this campaign, but in the materials that I saw, it wasn't prominent.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was never really articulated.
Well, I mean, race came into play hugely. I mean, you had someone in New Baltimore saying, if we open up RTA, you know, drugs will get to our community faster, when we know there's drugs there. I mean, the meth problem is huge. And then you have black folks at the polls saying, well, if you vote for RTA, then the white folks will continue to come in and take over. I mean, I actually saw both situations, you know what I'm saying? The people were screaming that. So we got, you know, there's so many issues that, like when you do the Chicago example, or you use Boston, or you use California, we're looking at different demographics, you know what I'm saying? Blacks or Latinos make up the majority of Chicago, but there's still a huge power base and it's a strong economic engine there. Same thing in California, the same thing in Boston, but here it's a little bit different. There's not as many foundations to support CDC. This is a whole different climate here, because that's my struggle since I've been here for 4 years to understand how do CDCs operate in this city. And it's tough, and you know.
And it's not clear their interests are fully aligned.
Right, oh, definitely. And there's no, you would think CDAD would be the overarching organization in terms of working with organization, but they're not. I mean, they do what they do, but I can't quite figure them out. And then like LIST means different things in different areas. Like LIST in Chicago is very dynamic, whereas LIST here is not so much. And then you have to look at the people you hire. It's so complex here. It is. Very, yeah.
And part of the problem is that the movement came relatively late to Detroit, and both the performance and the expectations were at least initially generally low. That's not to say there weren't individual people and organizations who did very good things, because there were. But compared to a Boston or a San Francisco or an Oakland or a Los Angeles, it was, you know, not an eye-catching scene. And the capacity building that was done in different cities around the country through Liskin Enterprise ratcheted up the organizational capacity of CDCs in this area a fair amount. I mean, the evaluation of that program, which was a 10-year intervention, showed, you know, marked progress in people's perception of the industry in Detroit. But the foreclosure crisis decimated the industry. So.
Yeah. And like you, I mean, people in other areas are more sophisticated in looking at government programs. There's tons of little government programs that offer community development type of initiatives, but you have to be able to figure them out. But just one quick to follow up. Is it, but when you look at like San Francisco, Oakland, where I'm from, and then you look at Boston and New York and Detroit, it seems like we get a, like in the Bay Area, we get an influx of dynamic people. You know what I'm saying? They want to live there because of the great climate, because of the energy there. And not so much for Detroit. Do you think that attracting dynamic people helps the situation, and maybe because of
I think attracting people helps the situation.
Yeah, that's true, that's true. But just the uniqueness that you find in those particular areas in terms of high degree concentrations and things like that.
But there's strong CNC industries in other places. There's strong industries in Philadelphia, which.
But Philadelphia almost
it-
falls in that.
Well, but it didn't 30 years ago. They kind of
Yeah.
did some smart things. Pittsburgh is still heavily a blue collar, middle class
Yeah.
town. But if you're losing population, the people who tend to leave are the people who are most willing and able to be opportunity seekers. And so those people are not getting replenished when the population is doing this.